back again. You can see there's one of our heads, so apparently our heads came back, and that's indeed the case. Few things you can see here: the intake ports, at least the portion closest to the manifold, has been ported and polished. More polished than anything. Most of the porting on these heads, effective porting, is on the exhaust side, and they've ported that. They ported that all the way through. That's the valve face up around the valve stem. And so, you know, like any port job, you don't know what you're going to get out of it till you get it. We'll find that out. A few things on the head that turned out a bit different than I thought. One, well, I'll still use these cylinder head shop for my stock head rebuilds. They do not do performance work, and so we had to go and source a new shop to do these for us, one that we haven't previously used. Excuse me. And that took a little hunting, a little finding, and where we ended up landing was with a place called Craig Conk Racing Heads, also extreme performance racing products, speed shop. And so they do a lot of head porting work. They rework blocks, take care of any number of things for you, balance cranks. And but we'd already taken our block to our standard machinist, and that worked out fine. So he reworked these heads for us. Got stainless steel manly valves, intake and exhaust. Got double springs, new spring caps, new locks. So I think everything's pretty well ready to go on the heads. So just short of installing them, they're complete. Do still have to install the freeze plugs on both ends, and that take a couple of seconds in total. So we're ready to go on the heads. Also, we're ready to go on the pistons. They got our pistons to us. The same shop did our pistons. Our machinist that did the block doesn't rework the piston rod ends, and so crank end of the piston rod, and so crank end of the connecting rod. So they reworked those for us. We mic'd them all out. They all look fine. Bearing clearances look proper, anywhere from 1,000ths to 2,000ths. Right now, we've actually installed 6 of these pistons, or I have, and right now I'm getting around 15,000ths clearance, which is okay. I wouldn't mind a little more, but 15,000ths is fine. The pistons themselves, ow, just hurt myself. Pistons themselves are Kelly Black pistons. They're hyper-eutectic pistons, and which means they should have good heat transfer properties and minimal expansion on heating. They also have dual reliefs, slightly larger reliefs than the stock pistons, and the stock piston also had matching reliefs on both sides. You could actually put it in upside down, and those reliefs were on both sides. So there you go on that. I guess one other note on the heads, without my asking, and it's fine that they did it, but they felt like that the bottom of the crank was, the bottom of the heads were too uneven, and they're probably correct. I'm not quite sure they are correct. So they decked them. They decked the bottom of the heads, which means that I also need to come and re-cc these heads. The expectation's about 59 cc's as is, with redecking them. We're looking at reducing that cc number, which would just increase our compression ratio. So that's not a challenge at all. But I do need to get me a graduated pipette from the lab, borrow one from the lab, and go ahead and cc these things officially. dials. You see 2 or 3, 4 of them, and if they're consistent, and they're consistent. I have installed 6 of the pistons. You can see I got this thing on an odd angle here, but installed 6 of the pistons. And after I installed the first one, actually, I checked the tolerance here between the deck of the block and the top of the piston, so that I could validate how much or what size head gaskets I was going to buy. Right now, the best I can come by, and I don't have, like I said, I don't have the higher end machinist equipment, but best I can come by is about 5 thousandths between the top of the piston and the top of the deck at top dead center. So that's quite small. We want about 40 thousandths on our quench, which means the space between the combustion chamber and the head and the space between the top of the piston, we want about 40 thousandths. So it's 5 thousandths clearance here. About the best I could do is go with 39 thousandths final thickness gaskets. So that's going to give us about 44 thousandths quench, which is, I think, quite good for this motor. And hopefully reduce detonation and give us good horsepower, good compression ratio, which ultimately going to give us good horsepower. So anyway, that's coming. So what I'm going to do now is I've gotten 6 pistons installed. Got 2 more pistons installed, number 1 and number 4, and excuse me, number 1 and number 5. So I'm going to go ahead and set this head back down. I just put it up here to easiest way to show it off. And so I'm going to set it back down and go ahead and install those last 2 pistons, and I'll let you ride along with me for one of them. I don't want to bore you too long. So I'll get right back to you then. We're going to start off this piston install by installing our set of rings for this piston. I've just been installing them as I go. You can do it any way you like, obviously. I've got a drawing here that you can't see very well because it's got a ring sitting on it, but basically it gives us our ring orientation. Listen, there's a number of opinions on ring orientation. I kind of went and chose the bulk of the orientation that had the bulk of the support, and it's going to be more than reasonable. I don't think any of the others were necessarily wrong. They were just different. I went with the one that had the, I guess, the popular vote. Also on the rings, these Kelly Black pistons specify the compression ring groove allowances. In this case, for a street stock, strong horsepower street stock motor, not blown, not a racer, not anything like that. Top ring got 26 thousandths, second ring got 16 thousandths, these compression rings. The oil rings turned out about 26 thousandths, which is stock, which is fine. So we're going to go ahead and install these based on our orientation chart, and I'll let you just hang out while we do that. Notice I don't have piston ring pliers, and that's not exactly true. I do have piston ring pliers, but I find it to be very convenient, depending upon the rings, how stiff the rings are, things like that. I find it convenient to do it by hand. You do need to be careful when you do it by hand, so as not to break the rings, obviously, scratch up the pistons, things like that. And so we do have to take some care. But if I had, I don't know, a big motor, big diesel motor or something like that, with larger rings, I'd be more worried about using a ring installation tool. I find them to be clumsy. I've been known to throw rings across my shop accidentally when they pop out of the pliers, and that's not a good event either. You got to go find your pliers or find your rings and hope you haven't damaged them. So oil rings are particularly easy. They're quite flexible, and because of their size, they're very, very thin rings. It makes them a bit easier to deal with. And of course, this particular piston's give me more grief than any of the rest of them have now, because I'm doing it on camera. I guess that's to be expected. So let's spin this ring around a bit. There we go. And then it's up to the compression rings. Now look, while I'm thinking about it, let you know, the second ring has a dot. I'm not even going to try to show you the dot. It's hard to see even for me here. But this dot tells you that's the top, and it also tells you in this case it's the second compression ring. So just be cognizant that not all rings are symmetrical, and therefore they will require some attention to make sure that you get them right. So, in with the second compression ring, and let's see, we've got it oriented correctly. And then the top ring does not have a top or a bottom, it's just the top ring, and so we'll install it. Okay, so rings are installed. Set this aside, and then before I push the piston in, I'm going to lift the cap off. I previously checked all the caps, or excuse me, checked all the tolerances with and without the bearings installed as part of blueprinting the motor. And so I had, these are new ARP fasteners on here, so I have previously torqued them, and and so I've added torque lubricant to these ARP fasteners, so I'm not going to do that again. Now it's time to oil. Got a small container of just standard engine oil here, and we put some engine oil on the piston, on the skirt, on the rings. Try not to turn the rings, obviously, just so that it will slide in and out of our ring compressor well, and it'll slide in and out of the piston well once it's installed, in and out of the cylinder well once it's installed. So we're going to take a little here, we're going to oil up our cylinder. And one thing you can't see on camera right now is that the crank journal, or not the connecting rod journal, for this particular piston is at bottom dead center. It's as far away as it can go. That way we don't have to worry, hopefully we don't have to worry about hitting it with our rod bolts. Additionally, I've got some 5/16, basically it's a radiator overflow hose that we're going to put on there just to make sure we don't hit anything, don't damage the journal on the crank. Now we're going to get our ring compressor tool. This is a very inexpensive ring compression tool. I use this one also on the 4.7 liter Jeep motor. It works. If I was an engine rebuilder for a living, I'd probably go buy a 4 20/10 inch cone, a sleeve type compression device, but I'm not a rebuilder for a living. So we're going to lift up the piston just a touch. We're going to lock it in to our ring compressor. It takes a little bit to get the right amount of tension to hold your rings in, but not hold your piston so tightly that you can't drive it down into the cylinder. But it can be done. Wrong rag. It can be done quite readily. It takes a little practice. So we're going to grab the persuader, and we're going to do very little persuading. First thing I like to do is go around and make sure that my ring compression tool is seated on the deck of my block so that no rings can try to sneak out the side. Or hopefully they won't sneak outside. And then we just start tapping. See it go right on in there. Now listen, I don't know how that sounds on the video. Those are very light taps, okay? I'm not beating this piston silly. I'm only tapping it, okay? So don't get carried away with your tapping. Now I'm doing this by myself, so I tend to put my hand down here and on the crank, and I just guide the journal, or guide the rod end onto the journal till my bearing contacts the journal. So it's in and it's against the crank, set against the crank. And so what I do, I rotate it 90 degrees so that this surface is level again. Pull off my protectors there, and now it's time to plastic gauge. Again, I don't always serious about plastic gauging. All my tight tolerance areas that are reasonable to plastic gauge. Plastic gauge is cheap. It doesn't take long. Make it right. Make it as right as you can make it. So I'll take our piece of plastic gauge out of the paper. And I've plastic gauged the other 6 that are previously installed, and I think I stated earlier they're all about 15 thousandths, which is fine. One thing, we'll talk about the oil pump later. I'm wishing that I had a little bit more gap in my bearings, but I don't. That's okay. Also, all of these rods have a number stamped into them on both the top portion and the bottom portion of the cylinder, or the piston end cap bore. So you want to make sure they're lined up. On this motor, all the numbers face out. For the pistons coming from this side, numbers face this way. Pistons coming this side, the numbers face the opposite way. So they face the direction the piston comes in. You start doing this when you take it apart. Take note of it, and you'll see. Also, if your machine shop puts your, in this case they put the pistons on for me. If they put the pistons on for you, they should get that right. They should know, and they will. So why does it matter? What if you flipped one around and put it in? I can show you that in a minute, but basically they're cut differently on either side. On the crank, there's something called the fillet radius, which is only on the side closest to the counterweight. And so if you look at a rod, one side is more square and the other side has an inset for the fillet radius. So there is a right and a wrong way, directionally, to install a rod. At least on this engine. I'm not saying it's on every engine. It's also that way on the 4.7. It's generally the case. So what we're going to do now, if we got our, we've got our plastic gauge in there. We're going to go to torque, give it a few seconds, let the plastic gauge conform. For these ARP studs, 50 foot-pounds of torque. They actually suggest a certain strain or a certain stretch gauge dimension, but not having a stretch gauge, they give you the alternative of a torque. And so here we're going with 50 foot-pounds of torque. So that one's installed with plastic gauge in it. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the plastic gauge and see what we see. Now these connectors require a 24-point socket for installation. Not an uncommon concept in fasteners, higher end fasteners particularly. So this is always a little bit tricky, getting this rod cap off. Sometimes you get lucky and it just comes right on up like that. Wow, it's a good day. So I doubt you can see from your altitude what that looks like here on the rod cap, but looks a lot like it did on the crank, and I won't bother to bore you with it again. But 15 thousandths. Whether we like 15 thousandths or not, and 15 thousandths is fine. It's certainly consistent, and consistent's good. I'm going to go ahead and take this off. I just like to rub a little off with my fingernail just to get the bulk of it away. Now, it's time to add assembly lube. It's not always the easiest thing. One thing I don't want to do, one thing you could do is you could turn the crank, and that would push the piston down, and then would give you some space to get in there and put some assembly lube. I don't like to do that. And the reason I don't like to do that is because that rotates the bearing against the journal without any lubricant present, and so we just don't like to do that. So put some lubricant in there now, and then we won't have to worry about rotating it after the lubricant's installed and spread out into the bearing space. Just don't like metal on metal. We especially don't like metal on new metal. Okay, so we got our lubricant installed. Now let's see if we can relocate the rod cap back onto the journal. And look, you want to be careful if you're doing it with by hand like this, by yourself particularly. It's not hard. Just tap it upward. Keep your hand on the rod. And then just reseat it. So just be cautious. That's the main thing. Again, we're going to check for our number. It's here. This is number 5. And then we're going to ease our rod cap back down on there. I find that getting the rod cap straight and lined up to put it on is one of the trickier parts of this process. So, and then we're just going to take it back to torque, and we're done. One thing I always do, one thing I did even with the crank, I didn't show you on the other video because I finished it offline, but one thing you always want to do is check your rotation. When I say check your rotation, expect increased friction with every component you add to the drive line, but you should still generally always get smooth rotation, even if it's with increasing pressure. You shouldn't get any grinding sounds. You'll certainly get friction sounds with each piston, because this have friction against the wall of the piston where your rings sit. But if you were to jam a ring when you install the piston, or if you locked up a bearing because of some issue with alignment or clearance, you would know just by giving a rotation after each additional thing is added to the line. So I'll show you what I mean. We're just going to rotate it, and it's doing great. One thing we're going to do while we're rotating it, let's go ahead and get number 1, which is the next cylinder to install. Get that journal at bottom dead center from that piston. So when we rotate it, we're ready to install the next piston. So that's 7 pistons, 1 more piston to go, and I'll let you watch that, but I'm going to let you watch it on high speed. I'm just going to finish up this video real quick. I was going to do a time-lapse installing that last piston, but now my time-lapse software doesn't seem to want to work right. So anyway, they're all installed, all 8, and I want to talk about a couple things. First, I'm going to use a high volume. My intention is to use a high volume oil pump on this particular application on this motor. And I made mention about bearing clearances earlier. I'd like to have them a little larger. You know, if I was in a perfect world, instead of 15 10,000ths on both the rod and the main bearings, I'd really like something more like 20 thousandths, primarily because I am going to be running a high volume oil pump, and it just gives you a little more little more opportunity to lubricate those bearings, or keep the fluid in those bearings for fluidized bearings. But 15,000 is okay. Certainly not a train wreck by any stretch. But again, ideally, I think if you're running high volume, you might want to consider slightly larger allowances within reason, obviously. It just gives you more oil flow, more splashing around in the pan to help lubricate the walls of pistons, things like that. So it's going to be fine, but that was what I was alluding to in the earlier conversation. And then finally, or not just finally, but I made mention about the clearances on the rods, and once again I misstated. It's 15 10,000ths, not 15 thousandths. There's 15 10,000ths on the rods, 15 10,000ths on the main, based on the plastic gauge results. So basically the bottom end's done. We're going to move on now. In the coming video, next video, we're going to move on to install the timing system, and also begin to install the oil system and the windage tray. We got to confirm the windage tray clearance now that all the pistons are in there. So once it's all together, we'll make sure everything's got clearance down there on the bottom end. And then we're also going to look at checking the clearance between the screen on the oil pickup tube and the bottom of the oil pan to make sure all our alignments are right, going with a high volume pump. Now we'll discuss that pump a little more. I may make some changes in the future based on my selection of a high volume pump. But anyway, we'll close this video for now. I hope everyone has a Merry Christmas. Take care.